Squad tournaments are very nostalgic for a large portion of the community. However, I feel like there are a number of problems with this as a format. Now, I'm biased because I didn't personally enjoy playing squads back in Chapter 2 Season 1, so just note that a lot of this is my own opinion on the game mode. I want to split this first into two different categories because this is important. Firstly, for lower level competitive players, and secondly for higher level competitive players too. When we're discussing if a competitive mode should be good for a large amount of players, a lot of the issues that will happen at high level play don't necessarily happen at lower level play and for the average player. Take for example finding a full squad. This is very difficult to do for lower level competitive players, and particularly getting your scheduling aligned so that players can consistently practice and play tournaments all together. However, for high level players, this isn't an issue because they are pros at the end of the day. They already have their full schedule aligned to play the game most of the day. Now in other games, such as Counter-Strike and Valorant, you have teams of 5, so more than the normal 4 which should be in squads, and these people seem to get along very well. However, Fortnite's whole memo is the fact that anyone can compete in the game, and limiting this by making it more difficult to get teams together definitely doesn't really fall into this kind of category. Now again, for high level teams, this does not matter at all. This is not an argument to make whatsoever because they are pro level players at the end of the day and their schedules are all going to have aligned up anyway. But I don't think it's something that we should completely ignore. Talking of things you can't ignore, lag is always been an issue in squads. Now I don't necessarily know if the lag that was in the reverse 2K cup was because of the fact that it was in this cup and it was squads, or if it was just because the current servers are not very good. If you played any competitive game lately, you'll know the servers have been particularly dicey, but it seemed like in some of the qualifiers for these, when I watched some player streams, it was unbearably laggy, worse than I'd ever seen. We have seen some really bad trios and duo comps, but I think this is probably the laggiest in-game tournament I have ever watched in my life. So I do have to assume that squads has something to do with it, but you gotta remember the servers already are very dicey this season. Another thing that when it comes to squads that I'm not particularly a fan of is the lack of clutch potential. Now when it comes to duos or even trios to an extent as well, if you have one player left alive in your team, there's a large chance that they can pop off and have a really incredible performance, in particularly duos. When it comes to squads, if you're alive as a solo against a team of 4, there's almost no chance you can make a big clutch play, in particular in an early game fight. Other games like Counter-Strike and Valorant have a lot shorter time to kill, so you can have these incredible clutch plays, but you don't really get to see that within Fortnite in a 1v4 situation that often. And honestly, I feel like if you end up getting 1 or 2 members down in an earlier mid-game fight, it makes it very difficult for you to end up coming back on this and actually clutching and winning the fight, which means that, and I don't think this necessarily allows you to play as defensively, and it really benefits those players who are hyper aggressive and kind of removes a little bit of the depth of the playstyles that are possible. Now, let's be real, a lot of these big clutch moments on broadcast are something that's really important for us as a community to share and to be excited about. I definitely think squads as its whole kind of removes this element a little bit and makes these much less likely to happen. And one of the things I've been noticing a lot with larger team modes in Fortnite is that drop spots just become worse and worse the more people you have on each team. Now in trios right now, with the current chest spawn rates not being 100%, there isn't an option to split a POI and disengage. Almost no teams in any round 4 heats or finals have been looting and then disengaging and actually been able to play out their game properly pretty much for the last 3 seasons. Add another member to the team, and if you have a team contesting, say, either any POI like Sweaty Sands, these guys are forced to fight and they have no option to disengage at all because they're going to just have absolutely no loot at all. With another member on each team, these fights will probably also last longer, which means that they're going to have even worse loot in their early game going into the mid game, which means they're probably going to have to fight another team in the mid game to get enough loot. Which basically means that if you are contested in your game, it's not over for you, but you're at a severe disadvantage, and being uncontested puts you at an incredible advantage. Now currently you already have a huge advantage when you're uncontested in trios, but adding another member to the team just makes it even worse. And one of the reasons this is so important to me is because squads is so much about getting set up in the early and mid game. Basically, if you get set up with a ton of materials, you don't even need good loot, just a ton of materials on all 4 of your members before the moving zone start, you're in a significant advantage because with that additional player, you can tarp so far in the moving zones before you need to pick up any refreshes and get more mat to keep the tarp moving. Now to me, I always love the fighting aspect of the game, and I do think it actually makes up a large portion of the skill gap. Yes, rotations, positioning, timing is all massive factors in this too, but I feel like the more players you add onto your team, the less important that actual skill of fighting becomes, and the more relevant the positioning and the teamwork aspect makes of this. Now, some people out there who listen to this video may think that that's great, you know, more teamwork the better, but I do think there needs to be a good balance between game modes which shows good teamwork and good skill, and I think duos and trios does that perfectly, purely in my own opinion. The fights are skilled, they're still mechanical, they involve a lot of teamwork and positioning aspects, and this leads on to my least favourite part about squads, and that is the quad spray. If you really watched any game of any squad tournament all the way up until basically before the 5th zone, you'll have noticed that a lot of the eliminations just come from assault rifle spraying. That's honestly just because it is the most efficient way to get huge damage off on your opponents. Now, this is an issue for me for two reasons. Now, the first one is that the mechanical skill of fighting is definitely dampened, which is something I've already mentioned, but this is because of the multitude of reasons, and I think the main one in this is that it's actually very, very difficult to track 4 opponents and 3 of your teammates all at the same time in one fight. I've already mentioned Valorant and Counter-Strike quite a lot in this video just to kind of get my points across, but I think this one's very, very key. Now, I've already mentioned these games a lot, but I think it's a very important factor because when you look at these games, when you're tracking 5 opponents, you're basically looking through a couple of corridors or a couple of predetermined angles that you're going to have set up. In Fortnite, when you're trying to fight 4 opponents at once who are creating a consistently changing environment with their builds, it's extremely difficult to keep track of the opponents and where they move. So because of this, most of the time, rather than doing any kind of box fights or build fights, a lot of the players will just quad spray at a specific opponent, pick up an elimination, and then this goes back to what we said earlier about the fact that now that one team has the advantage and the other team doesn't. A triple spray against a quad spray, I know exactly which one's going to be more powerful. The tracking element of this was actually something that I found extremely difficult while playing squads myself, as not a very good player back in Chapter 2 Season 1. Most of the fights, I just didn't know what was going on at all, and this is where my bias definitely shows because I am saying this because I personally really dislike this aspect of squads, but when I watch a lot of high-level teams, I see the same thing as well. Not necessarily that they can't keep track, but a lot of times that it just ends up being a complete mess of a fight, and you don't actually a lot of the times see the skill in the teamwork that you'd expect to see. Now in endgame, I think this is completely different. I actually think the endgame skill is really, really high for fighting and box fighting because of the fact that teams have so many mats, they can create so much space themselves. So interestingly, I actually feel like the early and mid to late game dynamics completely change, where I actually really do like the dynamics of squads in endgame. It's just before that, which I don't really like that much. But at the same time, squad spraying still really, really bad. And what was the second reason why I don't like this? Well, you get punished yet again for making a really little bit later rotate than you normally would. We've already mentioned a little bit earlier how being contested and uncontested is even worse when you play squads, but being late to rotate is also equally as bad. Now the reason for this is if you have to think, rather than having 3 people holding you, you're going to have 4 people holding you if you've just rotated a little bit later. Now you have 2 teams rather than 1, guess what? That's 8 players spraying you and your game is basically over. So in squads, your rotational skill and your timing is much more important. Then that relies on if you are contested or if you are uncontested to a huge extent. Which again is basically a conversation that I'm a little bit bored of talking about in Fortnite, because if you're contested, if you're uncontested is something that I talk about every video pretty much and every time I'm on a broadcast. This is something I'd actually like to reduce the RNG of rather than make it a little bit worse. Now squads definitely has its merits. I've obviously talked a lot about the problems that I have with the game, however there are some really, really interesting things about it too. The first one is the team dynamics. We've not really seen squads that much in tournament apart from Chapter 2 Season 1, so it's really cool to see trios that are already established, adding a new 4th into there and seeing how that plays out, and just seeing completely new squads being formed from old remnants of duos and just new solo players that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see together yet. These aspects are very, very interesting, and it does create a lot of interesting dynamics and playstyles that you wouldn't necessarily see in any other game mode. And I think the biggest one for me is that squad tournaments are just fun. Playing with a bunch of your friends, people in your Discord, or just high level players is really fun, and actually a lot of these are extremely good to watch as well. Now, I say that as a one-off tournament though. I wouldn't necessarily think that I would like to see a squad FNCS for 4 seasons next year. That may be very tough to watch, and I think it would get old a little bit early, especially with the qualms that I've already mentioned before. But for one-off tournaments like the Reverse 2K Cup that we've just seen at the weekend, it was fantastic. I wasn't able to play the Reverse 2K tournament, and it was NA East, but because it's fresh and it's something we don't play that much, it would be really interesting to play one on EU for myself. Hope you guys enjoyed this little bit of a rant video. Peace.